We are now in the early days of June, and the election took place in the month of October. You may think that a lot of time has gone by. And certainly our country's preoccupation at this point is no longer with the election, but rather with the resolution of the COVID pandemic. However, please bear in mind that I had to deliver my manuscript to Irwin in the closing days of November, and they have had to work on the manuscript ever since then. So this is not a willful delay on anybody's part. It's just a necessity of the publishing process. However, what's important is that we continue our joint preoccupation with the subject matter of elections. And in that sense, I want to give you a bit of a follow-up to what's been happening beyond the delivery of the manuscript to the publisher. What's been happening in the field of elections? Well, the first thing is that on January 22nd, 2020, the Parliamentary Budget Officer issued a report on the costing of the election. And this is quite interesting. For the first time ever, the Parliamentary Budget Officer had a role to play in the election. And he was reported by CTV News in the following manner. The PBO's report includes 9 recommendations for improvement, 7 of which he described as administrative and capable of implementation under the current structure of the law, though one change would require Parliament to improve the legislation by amendments. I doubt whether Parliament will have the opportunity now during the pandemic to look at this subject matter, but certainly before the next scheduled general election, it may want to do that. The next thing is a kind of general dealing with the subject matter of election security. And here the story is a little bit fuzzy. There are different news stories from different days, most of them in the month of February, about the subject matter of election security. Was there foreign interference or was there not foreign interference? And in my mind, the question is still open. First of all, we note that in the current government of Canada, the one that was constituted after the 43rd general election, there is no longer a portfolio entitled Minister of Democratic Institutions. The subject matter of elections is now dealt with by the President of the Privy Council, Monsieur Leblanc. He has been saying that foreign adversaries and competitors are increasingly targeting Canada in order to advance their own economic and national security interests. Well, that's hardly surprising. But in fact, there are divergent opinions on whether during the 43rd general election, was there foreign interference or was there not? And in fact, it's very difficult to tell. You will also note from the reference at page 582 of the book that Section 536 of the Canada Elections Act requires the Chief Electoral Officer to issue a report on the general election, and that in fact did take place on February 18, 2020. I'm looking at the press release that Elections Canada issued on February 18, and it highlights a couple of points that are of specific interest. Elections Canada focused its efforts on improving services to electors and political entities. Not much of a surprise there. It put in place a comprehensive security strategy, again, that's focused on security and the use of computer systems and computer networks to try and divert a part of the electorate to exercise their positions in such a manner as to falsify the results and perhaps to work in favor of foreign governments rather than the Canadian electorate. Again, this is somewhat inconclusive. Elections Canada says that it enhanced voter registration services and the quality of the data in the National Register of Electors. Again, technicalities. The agency experienced some difficulties recruiting and retraining the required number of poll workers using the existing staffing model for polling locations. I submit to you that this is just a continuation of the situation from earlier elections. It still needs to be resolved, but so far we haven't quite devised a way of ensuring that a sufficient number of people are available and hired to work on election day. And certainly we don't have a system whereby there is some sort of assurance that they will be competent to perform their tasks. The historical background for this should be referenced to the Neufeld report, which most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. And then finally, an interesting point about the cost of the general election. There was a news report on the 18th of February saying that the preliminary costing revealed that this election, the one in 2019, cost $504 million, which is a little bit ironic in the following sense. The 2015 election was an awful lot longer, and yet it cost less to run. Not quite sure where this discrepancy comes from. It may be the value of different services that Elections Canada needed to pay for, with the one notable exception that the significant and robust upgrades to computer systems that Elections Canada needed for the purpose of national security of elections was probably a great contributing factor to this. The next item will be of particular interest for the legal community. At pages 737, 738, I discuss the most recent judicial decision that is of importance in the field of elections, and that is the case of City of Toronto versus Attorney General of Ontario. At the time I handed in the manuscript, the Court of Appeal for Ontario had rendered its decision. What we learned on March 26, 2020, is that the Supreme Court of Canada has agreed to hear an appeal from that. Now, this is a really interesting and at the same time important case, and I'll tell you why. In 2018, the City of Toronto was scheduled to hold its municipal election. After the election period started and before it ended, the Ford government was elected at the provincial level, and on the 14th of August 2018, it enacted something called the Better Local Government Act, which made changes to a number of different parts of the municipal election system in Toronto, right in the middle of the campaign. And the question, generally speaking, was put to the courts: is it feasible, is it democratically proper to interrupt a campaign and to change the rules in midstream? The The ruling of the Court of Appeal for Ontario said that the concepts of democracy and the rule of law have no canonical formulation. Very interesting figure of speech. Basically, what the judgment talks about is that written provisions of law take precedence over unwritten constitutional principles. Now, this is interesting in two ways. First of all, it gives the Supreme Court of Canada an opportunity to define, in terms of law and in terms of general political principles, what is democracy and how much tampering with democracy is permissible in this kind of regime. And secondly, this will give the court the first serious opportunity, I think, since the Quebec Secession reference, to arrive at some sort of definition of what is democracy. So watch for that. And then finally, the most recent news item of all, which dates from June 1st, 2020, and that is the suggestion that the Commission on Leaders' Debates be made permanent. I think, personally, that would be a good step. Where do we go from here? And along the way, why is this book important? Well, I certainly will continue to focus on elections as specific, highlighted manifestations of the combination of law and politics. And I suggest to readers of the book that they should do the same. I will use this text in teaching election law at McGill this fall. And those of you who are joining us today who teach should really not be reticent about using this book in your respective classes. For my part, I will continue to write about elections in the future and to use this as a focus of interest and of preoccupation, both in my own personal research and in the work that I do with the Institute of Parliamentary and Political Law. Now, as a final word in this general introduction to anatomy of an election, I want to say another word of thanks. I began this presentation by thanking the people at Irwin, and I maintain that position. But at the end now, I'd like to reserve my greatest thanks to my two mentors during my public service career. And of course, I'm referring first of all to Yvon Tarte, who was General Counsel at Elections Canada when I arrived there in 1990, and more recently to Rob Walsh, who was law clerk of the House of Commons when I started working there in 2001. I think it's fair to say that without their encouragement and their support, this book would never have seen the light of day. With that, dear colleagues, I'd like to thank you for participating in today's event. I hope you enjoy the book, and I hope, honestly, from a commercial point of view, I hope you buy a number of copies of it. Thank you. Merci bien à tout le monde.